Hello and welcome to GreenShift Business Lines video series on climate change and clean tech. I am Ramesh. The COP28 climate talks have just ended. There's a lot of excitement about some words, namely phase out of fossil fuels. Now, what exactly does it mean? And what are the implications of the COP28 on India? In this video, we will take a close look at some of these points. Please do watch this video. You may have been reading in the papers about results of COP28, screaming headlines like phase out of fossil fuels, an historic agreement about fossil fuels and so on. Now, you get an impression that the rich countries, the developed countries have been kind of tamed into acquiescence. What exactly happened at COP28? No, but first, let's start with some background. What is COP28? What is COP in the first place? COP, as we explained in some of the videos, previous videos in this series, COP means Conference of Parties. Parties here means countries that were signatories to the UN, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This convention took place in 1992 and almost all the countries in the world signed up. So every year, all these countries meet in a place and then discuss where we stand with respect to climate change, climate action and so on. So these meetings are called COP meetings. And the 28th such meeting happened in Dubai between the 30th of November and 13th of December, just concluded. And now at the end of these meetings, as it typically happens, they come out with a kind of an agreed text. It may or may not be an agreement. At the end of Paris conference, there was an agreement. Mostly it may not be an agreement, but one text in which everybody has signed, all countries have signed, and they say, okay, this is what we have broadly discussed and agreed upon. So this time also they came out with such a text. As you all know, scientists have found out that the world is getting hotter because of greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, methane, and a few other gases. These gases go up in the atmosphere and form a blanket and prevent heat from the earth from dissipating out into the space, so that the world is warming. And scientists have found out that if the world gets hotter by up to 1.5 degrees Celsius from the levels that obtained in the pre-industrialization era, which is roughly 1850 to 1900, 1.5 degrees hotter than that level by the year 2100, we are kind of safe. If it goes to 2 degrees, it's bad, but we can somehow cope up with that. But if it goes beyond 2 degrees, it's very bad and it gets worse all the way up. You should not think that 2100 AD is way away, long way away, 76 years away. And therefore, we don't have to concern ourselves too much about it, because the deleterious effects of climate change are already upon us, as we are seeing it every day. We are already experiencing flash floods, terrible storms, forest fires, heat waves, bleaching and destruction of corals, and that has its own chain reaction upon food chains, agriculture, erratic monsoons, vector-based diseases, lethal levels of humidity, and so on and so forth. We are already experiencing this, and as the world gets hotter and hotter, we will have more and more of these things, and we are going to be in a very big crisis. As things stand today, we have to worry about it now, and that's what everybody is doing, and that's what happens. This is the central discussion in any COP meeting. In COP28 that just got concluded in Dubai, there was a final text that all the countries agreed upon. One line in the text said, phase out of fossil fuels. This line has got everybody excited. Why? Because this is seen as the triumph of developing countries over developed countries. Why? Again, because developed countries, the rich countries, were always resisting acknowledgement, the use of words fossil fuels, because they are themselves big users of fossil fuels, mainly gas, natural gas. They have been telling developing countries, don't use coal, don't burn coal. For sure, coal is a much worse fossil fuels. It is the biggest emitter of carbon dioxide. But developing countries like China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, coal is the energy mainstay. We have nothing else. The developing countries, of course, did not like this, and there has been a lot of tussle between the two over this point. The developed countries wanted a certain sequencing, first coal and later natural gas and then oil. The developing countries were always saying we should not be sequencing like that. It should be all fossil fuels. time. For the first time in a draft, there is an acknowledgement of the need to phase out fossil fuels, and this has got everybody very excited. It's not wrong, because this has happened for the first time, and it's okay. It means that the developed countries have finally been brought around to agree on this point. Here is a note of caution. We cannot afford to get carried away by this. Really, it is not that consequential. Although what has happened really is some people in the room who always knew that there was an elephant in the room have finally acknowledged the presence of the elephant in the room. But the elephant is not going away. Now, what has just happened is the developed countries have mumbling and moaning, kicking and screaming, finally agreed broadly to phase out fossil fuels. Here, we have to look at the nuances of the language of the text. Paragraph 28 recognizes the need for deep, rapid, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gases and lists several ways of doing that. Having said that, paragraph 28D says transitioning away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly, and equitable manner so as to achieve net zero by 2050 and so on. In international agreements, in every word there is a nuance embedded. Now, the words just, orderly, and equitable are not as innocent as they look. It almost means that the developed countries are saying, well, we will reduce fossil fuels, reduce the use of natural gas, in a fair and equitable manner as and when it is possible by us, whenever we can. This is actually a large loophole, and many experts have pointed out that these are loopholes through which the developed countries can escape. And to make matters worse, para 29 reads as follows: recognizes that transitional fuels, the operative words here are transitional fuels. Transitional fuels can play a role in facilitating the energy transition. What are these transitional fuels? By transitional fuels, they actually mean natural gas, which means they're also saying that natural gas can play a facilitating role or an interim role until such time as the world moves completely away from fossil fuels. Now, these are loopholes through which a developed country can kind of escape their liability. What will happen because of this is, what could happen is, the developed countries, because of geopolitical issues and so on, will continue to use natural gas, and maybe they get into some little bit of coal also, maybe clean coals, maybe coal thermal power plants with carbon capture, which they can afford to. And the developing countries, without any other alternative, will also continue to burn coal. India itself has said that it will increase its thermal power capacity from something like 25 gigawatts, that was the target earlier, to something like 75 to 80 gigawatts. Huge jump, because we have nothing else, says the minister, R.K. Singh. While all these are happening, the world is getting hotter and hotter, and it is going to affect everybody. Now, does it all mean that there is nothing from COP28? That's not true. There are some goodies. For example, there is an acknowledgement in the text that the financial flows from the rich countries to the developing countries for climate action is woefully, grossly inadequate, consistent. It is completely inconsistent with the requirements. Repeatedly stated this in paragraph after paragraph. And there is a welcome emphasis on adaptation. Adaptations are measures that are taken to cope up with the ill effects, the bad effects of climate change that are no longer avoidable. These could be in terms of, say, building stormwater drains or shelter for protecting people if there is a storm, maybe protection against heat waves, building dikes along the sea coast, heat-resistant agriculture, stocking up medicines and foods. All these measures that keep us ready just in case a climate event happens, we should be able to cope up with that. These measures are called adaptation, as opposed to mitigation, which are measures to prevent further global warming, which could be like stopping the use of fossil fuels, stopping burning coal, and so on. Mitigation is more in the interest of developed countries, while adaptation is more in the interests of developing countries. This time around, there is a fairly equitable balance between mitigation and adaptation. There is a very welcome emphasis on adaptation. And again, there is a recognition that there are not enough funds flowing for adaptation measures. Last year in COP27 in Egypt, they set up this loss and damage fund, which was the headline of that event. And now, this loss and damage funds has attracted some pledges. That is, some countries have pledged some money, some amounts for putting into this loss and damage fund, something like $800 million, which is really nothing. $800 million is hardly anything. If you remember, last year, Pakistan alone suffered damage worth $30 billion because of the flooding situation there. $30 billion, just one country in 1 year. So this $800 million is hardly anything, but then this is something like, if you give a peanut to a hungry man, he will grab it. Anything helps. Now imagine the US, which is spending billions and billions of dollars in support of Ukraine in its war with Russia, has contributed $17 million to this fund. So that is how inadequate the pooling of finance into this fund is. But at least a beginning has been made, and hopefully more will come into it later. So this brings us to a bigger, larger question as to whether these COP meetings matter at all. This is one question that has been in the mind of many people. Do COPs matter? After all, nothing happens, nothing gets done. Is broadly the thinking. But that's not quite true. Indeed, nothing much comes out of the COP meetings themselves, but these COP meetings generate tremendous amount of publicity, create a lot of awareness about climate change, because of which elsewhere work gets done. A lot of non-state actors get into the play. Say, for example, a lot of financiers are now today saying that they will not fund any activity that has a carbon footprint. That's a very welcome step. Lots of companies, corporate sector, large companies, they have all set themselves a net zero target. They all are working towards reducing their own carbon footprint. And a lot of NGOs are getting into the act. Many people are also getting into what is called nature-based solutions, growing bamboo, growing trees, growing mangroves, and so on and so forth. It is hard to imagine that all these things would be happening if the COP meetings had not been taking place. So these COP meetings do have a value. While they themselves may not produce the results of the order expected of them, they do result in multiple activity all around the world. There is some data that illustrates this point. In 2015, when COP21, the historic COP21 took place in Paris, which resulted in the now famous Paris Agreement, the world was on a trajectory to go to 4 degrees warming by 2100. 4 degrees. That is disaster, as disastrous as you can imagine. From there, we have reached below 3 degrees. 2.5 to 3 is what people are saying now. By the way, today we are at 1.1 degrees. If the safe limit is 1.5, we are already touching 1.1. So there is not much headroom left for us to do. The journey from 4 degrees to under 3 degrees, 2.5 to 2.9, has been very hard and arduous. But as it typically happens in these things, as we go along, you reach a tipping point when things really start accelerating. And hopefully that is what will happen in this case, and mankind will be able to survive the crisis of its own making. Thank you.